Did you know you can work remotely as a book editor? Is it possible to get started with little experience? What about a degree? Do you need that? Let's find out on today's episode of Time We Discuss. Today on Time We Discuss, I have Jenny DeLima here. Jenny, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So, Jenny, I understand, you're a statistician
Or
and
I
you
was.
also, I'm sorry, you were.
Yes.
Okay. And now you're an editor, is that correct?
hmm
Okay, so what I'd like to do, we'll tackle both those, but I definitely want to talk about your role when you were a statistician. So what was that like? What was a typical day like when you were doing that?
I mostly generated reports and then I would look to see if there were any significant findings. And so part of it was we would have this large pool of people that we were looking at and making sure we were representing the people that we hoped to be representing. And it's hard not to do this in a way where I'm still vague, and that's just because of the confidentiality of what I did. But for instance, we might have something that would look concerning when you looked at the numbers on their own, and then running those statistical tests to make sure that was it significantly different from what we were expecting or not, that sort of thing.
So when you're working as a statistician, you're working with people. So this could be, I'm just throwing ideas out there. This could maybe be like crime statistics, or it could be birth rates or something like that. What other statistics do people work with, like in your role? Like if I wanted to be a statistician for a sports team or the sports industry, I guess we can call it that. How does that work? Is that like a very similar idea, you think? Can you talk
I
about
would
that?
think so. Yeah, so you'll usually have these large pools of data sets that come to you. But for instance, when I was working on research teams as a graduate student, and so just for some background information, that was in the field of psychology. And so we would have all these interviews and things that we would do, or tests we would run, or we would do cognitive assessments on children. And then we'd want to see, for instance, where is the average and how does that compare to the average district-wide, statewide, nationwide? How are these numbers comparing and what sort of indicators is this giving us as to how the children here are learning compared to other places or their peers nationwide? And is this so statistically different that we need to be paying attention to it? Or again, those numbers on paper, they might look scary and they might tell us that there's a problem here, but really when we're looking at them in that broader sense, maybe there's really not. So we're looking at those types of things.
Now, in your role, did you work in like an organization that like that is your purpose and you're contracted with other places, or were you like an in-house statistician for like an insurance company? Like how does that typically work? They have like these big firms that are just employee statisticians. What is that like?
I worked for a national nonprofit, and that was what I did day in and day out. So I was an actual employee. I wasn't contracted to them. And then later I went to a research role at a university. And then the same thing, that's really what I did.
Wow. Okay. And in your role, how often are you working with the same data sets? Is it, because I have no idea how long it takes to analyze and create these reports. Is this like, one data set lasts a week, or is it a month? Is it a day? What is that like?
It will really differ depending on who you're working for and what type of project it is. So, for instance, at the nonprofit, we would have a whole new data set come in every single year. So, we're running different tests on that data set, but then we're also compiling the information that we've accumulated so far and running these different comparison data sets because obviously we want to know how we're faring that year compared to years past. So, we need to take more of that longitudinal look.
So I'm assuming you probably went to school for like statistical analysis or something like that.
So I went to school for psychology, but when you are going on the research track, you take a ton of classes in statistics. And so I used to think that maybe I was just okay at math. And then in my undergraduate year, I took my first stats class and I loved it. And I did so well that my professor said, "Are you taking this class again? Have you already been exposed to this material?" And I said, "No, I'm just really fascinated by it. And I think it's so interesting what we can pull from this type of information. Granted, we can't just look at it from a quantity perspective only. We also have taken that qualitative information so that we can make those kind of extrapolations." And then from there, I went on to grad school where I took something like two or three stats classes every year.
When you went on to get your master's degree, what was that in? Was that related to statistics?
That was also psychology. So I have a master's degree in applied developmental psychology. which means we're looking at the developmental subset of psychology, but applied means that we aren't looking at it just the pure research. We're seeing how we can take all that we're learning and using it in the real world setting in different sectors within the real world. So I know that a lot of my cohort went on, for instance, to work for the government.
So when I think of people working with statistics, I think of like an actuarial scientist or
Right.
anyone that's involved in science is going to be dealing with statistics. That's kind of where my brain goes immediately. Um,
Mhm.
in your experience, when you're working as a statistician, is it common for people that kind of are similar to you, where it's like they were just good at statistics and they kind of found their way into it? How important is a specific, from your experience, how important is a specific undergrad degree to following a career as a statistician?
I think it's essential because you have to have all that knowledge and information about how to even run these tests, which tests to choose, how to apply it, how to interpret your findings. And without that, you really don't have the information to do any of those positions. And so, for instance, I worked with a lot of people who did have degrees in mathematics or engineering, something where there was a heavy emphasis on math.
Let's talk about your transition out of being a statistician. Did you go from being a statistician to being an editor directly? Was there something in between? How did that transition unfold for you?
I had a transitional period because when I had my second child, I was pregnant with her when I was working at the university. And before then, I'd been able to work from home with my oldest child. And it just made me realize I don't want to be gone all the time. And I'd had an offer for another job as a statistician, and the pay was excellent. And it had all these great benefits that came with it. But just the thought of going every day wasn't something that I personally wanted to do. And so I decided to just take a break and sort of reorient myself and weigh what's important to me, what do I really want to do, that sort of thing. I'd always been involved in writing and editing in some capacity. So, for instance, I wrote for my high school newspaper, and then I continued into college and wrote for that paper and edited that paper. And then every position I had after that, so even as a statistician, I was also in charge of interviewing people and writing blog articles for our weekly blog, and then I would have to self edit them. So I always had something going on that wasn't just math. And it made me realize, I've always really loved reading, but I was also one of those people that grew up hearing that don't pursue an English degree because there's no money in it. You're never going to be able to find something to support yourself if you study literature. And so it was something that, even though that passion was there, I pushed it aside because I was trying to be pragmatic about my financial future. But I think too, that's one of those things where we have to really look at, I can do this, but I'm going to feel completely miserable all the time. And just because you're good at it doesn't mean you should keep doing it. And so for a while during that transition period, I also enrolled in a post-baccalaureate accounting program. And I went up to my final steps into becoming a CPA. But it just like hit me like a bus. I thought, there's no way I can keep doing this for the rest of my life. So I was doing all these volunteer things to help get into editing and see what it was like. And for instance, I read a whole bunch of middle grade novels and I wrote the accelerated reader questions for them as a volunteer. Or people might have short stories, that sort of thing they wanted me to look at and edit. And I would do that as a volunteer. But the whole time I started reading about it and what sort of training do you need and how can you do this effectively? So that all led into transitioning into doing it full time.
I'm kind of reading between the lines here. It sounds like you don't have any formal training as an editor. You didn't go back to school to be an
I
editor.
didn't go back to school, no, but I did eventually get my first position with a small press. They had training that they led you through, and then you learned about style guides and that sort of thing, and then their style guide. But I also went to multiple classes. So there are multiple places you can go to classes, even online. But I also wanted to read about what the writing craft itself is like, because I think that gives you a better foundation for being able to take that knowledge and apply it. Because if you don't really understand it from a writer's perspective and how the craft itself works, then I don't think you have as solid of a knowledge base as you do if you attended only editing training. So yes, I have taken multiple classes. I've done classes through the EFA. ACES does a lot of webinars. I've attended every single one that I possibly can. Louise Harnby has a lot of classes. I've attended almost everything that she's ever put together. Club Ed is another place that has training for editors, but it also depends on the type of editing you're doing.
That makes sense. So the other day I was actually speaking with Roger Smith. He's a CTO, and we were talking about education. We were talking about formal education versus other online opportunities. We didn't mention any, actually he did mention Coursera as a specific one. But yeah,
Oh,
that you have different modules on like LinkedIn. There's all kinds of different platforms out there. And so my goal right now is I wanted to see what you experienced if you could add on to that. And it sounds like yes, that you basically are adding onto it. You don't have to necessarily go
right.
back for another formal degree. There are other
Oh,
opportunities
exactly.
there that you can leverage. Okay.
Yeah, and I think that's the case too with a lot of people I know who are editors now who I'm friends with. They might have gone to school, for instance, for journalism or graphic design, something that seems completely unrelated to editing, and yet you can take so many of these skills and really utilize them when you're editing. So, for instance, my psychology background, I think, has been pivotal to my understanding of character and character arcs. And we talk about goal motive conflict all the time. Well, that really comes down to character too, and being able to understand that person on a deeper level. And granted, here our character or our person we're understanding is fictional, but the same rules really come into play.
So let me interrupt you for a second. So I've a very, very limited understanding of the dynamic between the writer and the editor. When I think of editor, I think I'm very like amateur. It's spell checking, it's grammar checking, and that's kind of where it ends. But based on what you're saying, kind of makes me throw this question at you. Whenever so you talk about like the psychology component, do you ever throw ideas back at the author? Like, hey, did you think of this? Did you think of that? Or is that completely outside of the scope of an editor?
So what I do is called developmental editing. That's mostly what I do. And then also line editing. Developmental editing is looking at what we call the big picture components. So we are looking at things like character believability, their character arc. Do they come across as likable or not? Are they responding in a way that's suitable for the events happening around them, their circumstances? Even the setting plays a part. And so that's mostly what I do. And I will usually ask them questions. And it's not because I want them to answer me, it's because I want them to think about it and think about, well, how does this work here then? But yes, I will see like patterns, for instance, in the manuscript, or there might have been something that a character said about themselves or someone else, let's say like 150 pages back, and now their reasoning has changed. So I might bring up, well, earlier they had an issue with this. So could that still be playing a part right here? Could that still be what's motivating them now, but in a different way? And so, yes, I will bring things up like that.
That is so fascinating. Wow. Okay. I'm assuming this is the case. I'm hoping you'll know the answer to this. Um, so this is tangentially related. Does the same thing work with like television, with film? Do they have these developmental editors? I think that's what you said, right?
Yes.
Do they do the same thing for like believability and consistency between the character throughout the movie, throughout the series, whatever? Does that exist?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You'll find it across every avenue of storytelling because really, when we talk about story, it all comes down to the same thing. And what makes a good story in one medium is going to make a good story usually in another medium as well. So, yeah, you'll have people that are checking for character and consistency and all that sort of thing too.
That's so cool. I had no idea such a thing existed. That's my mind just, you know.
Okay.
Um, so to be an editor, I'm assuming one has to really enjoy reading. Is that a fair assumption?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so if you don't like to read, then probably this career is not for you.
Right. And I wouldn't say just because of what you're doing day to day, but also I really believe it's important to read in the genres that you edit in because you want to be able to get a good grasp of what's, quote unquote good or bad, but also you want to see what's trending, what is picking up in popularity right now. And if you don't know that, you're not going to serve your clients as well as you could. So just as an example, even in romance or fantasy, we'll see certain tropes that really take off and they become extremely popular, and then other tropes that are falling out of favor. But if all you're reading is based on books you read 10, 20 years ago, you might not be aware of that or even understand how they come across in these books. So you might know about the trope, but you don't really know how to execute it or how someone else could execute it.
Okay, so that brings me to this next question. Within the role of editors and or development editors, are there also people that focus on specific genres? Do you have editors that they only do, fantasy or romance or
Oh,
something like
yes.
that?
Yes. So I tend to be a little bit broader than some people are. They might say that they only do cozy mysteries or they only do a certain type of nonfiction, but I also won't ever edit something that I'm not familiar with. If I don't know very much about that genre, or even one example is I'll edit historical fiction, but if I don't know very much about that time period, I'm not the editor for that person because, again, you have to have that understanding already so that you can help them really get their manuscript to the next level because otherwise you don't really have enough to contribute. You're not going to be able to pick things out that aren't going to resonate with your reader.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, if I'm an author and I'm looking for an editor, do I typically have the ability to interact with my editor ahead of time and determine this editor is good for me, or is that more determined at the corporate level based on who's available? You know, maybe their likes, dislikes, for lack of better words, their interests. How does that typically unfold? That relationship between the author and the editor? How's that begin?
I would always strongly recommend that you get a sense of who they are before you even begin working with them or sign a contract because, and depending too on how often you anticipate communicating with them, your personality styles are going to play a part in that. And it's just like with any type of relationship, you want to know that you can trust this person, that you can be vulnerable with them because so much of our writing does feel very, very vulnerable to open it up to someone because we're asking them to critique this. We're asking them, tell me what's wrong. And if you don't have that level of comfort that you're hoping for, then any, not necessarily criticism, but any feedback that could be construed as negative is just going to feel that much harsher because you don't have that comfort level with that person and know that it's coming from a good place. So yes, definitely get a feel for what they're like ahead of time.
When you're working on a project, are you typically juggling multiple projects? I'm assuming you probably are because you probably make suggestions or whatever. It goes back to the person, then you jump on the next project, and then they kind of go back and forth. What's your project load typically look like?
Yeah, there always is some sort of juggling, or not really juggling so much, but switching back and forth. And part of it has to do with the mental load that each project comes with. So I might have a quick second round that I need to go over. That's not going to take the same amount of mental focus as a first round that is brand new to me will. So if I, for instance, just feel like I've exhausted a lot of my resources for the day, I might switch over to something easier. And I'm using that term very loosely because I know this is also going to vary a lot from person to person, or even that's why I like doing different genres. So for instance, I might be editing a historical romance and then I might switch for a while and go to a picture book. Again, just because a picture book is going to use a different part of my brain, I'm going to be employing different skills, and it helps me see each thing with a fresh perspective as well because I'm no longer so focused on this where I might have hit a wall. And so I think it's the same thing with anything we do in our life, where if we switch what we're doing, it can help bring new clarity to something that we've had an issue with.
Earlier in our discussion, you talked about wanting to be home with your children. You had that opportunity before, and you didn't want to go back to your previous role. Is it safe to assume that a lot of these roles, from your experience as an editor, are a lot of them hybrid or remote? What does that typically look like from your experience?
The great majority of them are remote. I do see listings for some that are hybrid, but even those are really, really rare now. And I think part of that's just because of the pandemic and so many jobs already switching to the possibility of remote work. And there really isn't a lot of reason for people who edit to go in person a lot of the time. So it makes sense.
If someone wanted to be an editor, I know we talked about the process you went through kind of loosely. What was the time frame like from when you first decided that you wanted to pursue this until you were ready to apply for an editor job? What was that time span like?
It was at least a few years. And so I did start doing things again where it started off as either something I did for free, again, just to get that experience. And then it gradually switched to maybe I can trade this for services. So for example, I edited a fantasy in trade of piano lessons for one of my children. I just started also asking people if I could be a beta reader, that sort of thing, just to get an idea of what do early on manuscripts look like, what are some of the things that I'm seeing, and then also how are these authors responding to the feedback that I give them. So am I being helpful or not? Am I phrasing this in a way that they understand? And I think too, that also gave me some better ideas for how to adjust my framework when I was writing editorial summaries later on.
So using the phrase beta reader, something
Oh,
else,
yes.
I have no idea. I'm assuming, it's like kind of like a first read. You maybe even use that phrase. What's that actually like? What is a beta reader? Is that something that people actually, is that looped into a role of editor as well sometimes? Or what is that?
It is sometimes, and then editors will do it as a paid service, but you can find beta readers for free as well. Usually it's just my manuscript is done. I've tweaked it a bit myself. I've edited it. Maybe I'm ready for the next step, sending it on to an editor, or maybe it's already even been to an editor. And then these people read it and provide their feedback, such as things that they think should change, maybe characters they weren't really drawn to, but they were supposed to be, that sort of thing.
Okay, all right, wow, something else I didn't
It's
know
like a
about.
little, yeah, it's like a little reading focus group, really.
Now, I want you to look back at all the different things you did in order to line up your career as an editor. And what do
Mhm.
you think was the one thing, hands down, that was, I want to say, invaluable, that it just like, yes, this was incredibly helpful? What would that be?
For me, it was joining the EFA, which is the Editorial Freelancers Association. And that's because there are so many people there that have, some of them, decades of experience. And so you're learning about not just the skills needed, but all the real world practicalities that come along with it, such as balancing your time commitments, how to charge your rates, what kind of rates you should charge, payment methods, your website. I mean, everything that goes along with it, not just the editing itself. And it feels like any sort of question you could ever possibly ask, such as Word acting up and giving you some weird result that you were not anticipating, someone will have an answer for you, and very likely they'll have it to you within like an hour or two.
So it sounds like it's a pretty active group.
Oh yeah, it's really active. I think like half my email inbox is just posts from the EFA.
Now, what's the saturation like? Are there a lot? Is it hard to get freelance jobs through something like that? Is there a lot of competition? What does that look like?
Yes. So for the EFA posting, there are tons and tons of people that will respond within an hour. And so I've heard from other authors who posted there that within an hour, they're almost overrun with responses from people that they now have to weed through and pick out, okay, well, who do I want to even respond back to? So sometimes when you don't get a response for one of those posts, it's not because you were never in the running. It's almost like that analysis paralysis where how much time do I really want to devote to this? And I've just taxed myself beyond what I anticipated. So I can't even come up with the energy to respond to one more message. But I think the same is true in the online groups. So Facebook, for instance, there are groups for finding an editor, or people will ask in some of these writing groups, do you know of an editor? And it does just feel like they are completely drowning in replies. But I would say there too, you have to be very, very careful of looking for scammers, because there are so many people now that will respond to those and they don't really have any editorial training, experience. They might say that they're an editor, but really what they're going to do is take your manuscript and run it through Grammarly and then give it back to you. So it's just something to be cautious with.
What are some of the things people do to vet those editors? Do they ask for like references, for lack of better words? What's typically done to try to weed those people out?
So I would not rely upon just their reviews or asking for testimonials, because those can all be faked. The number one thing that I suggest is asking if they'll do a sample edit and then sending them part of your manuscript to have them edit it. And that's just because you can't really fake a sample edit. And if you are suspicious that they maybe ran it through Grammarly or something similar, do the same thing yourself and see what results come up, and then you can compare them. But even having a meeting like this over Zoom or a phone call, that helps establish that this is a real person and that they really are who they say they are, not someone claiming to be editor so and so, because that's happened before too.
So you talked about sending a sample size. What's a good sample size? 1 page, 5 pages, a chapter? What does that typically look like?
So we always go by word count, and that's just because the number of words per page can differ so greatly depending on font size, your spacing, all that sort of thing. So usually editors will do a 1,000 word count free sample. Some of them will ask for payment, which does make sense because you're basically asking them to give up an hour, 2 hours of their time for free. So I do think that's understandable, but usually it's not a great amount. And I think it's worth it just for that trial run to see how it goes.
So that's good to know. If you go to submit a portion of your manuscript and someone's charging you a certain amount of money, it's not necessarily a red flag.
Right, exactly. That just means that maybe they also are so booked up that they have to charge that in order to even justify to themselves taking the time to do that sample edit.
Wow, Jenny, this is a lot of really good information.
Oh, good.
Running a little short on time. So what I want to do now, I do have a surprise question I like to sometimes throw at my guest. Has absolutely nothing to do with what you do for a living. So the fun surprise question I have for you for today is, as we get older, invariably, there are some things that we miss about our youth. It could be recovering quickly from exercising or maybe recovering from illness. It might be wearing your hair a certain way or staying out late into the night. Looking at your lifestyle, what is one thing that you miss from when you were younger?
The hours of uninterrupted free time to read. I remember reading the Thornbirds straight through because I had nothing else to do and it was fantastic. And even though I did go out and I had an active social life and I was involved in a lot of things in high school, that's one of my happiest memories.
I can relate to that because, and I think this plays at least a small part in it. Having kids, that takes away a lot of time, especially if you're an involved parent. It takes away a lot of time.
Yes.
So I can understand where you're coming from.
And now I have two dogs, which is really just like having a second round of children. I don't know if you can hear they're play fighting a little bit in the background, but yeah, it's like toddlers all over.
I love it. Jenny, one other thing I like to do for my guests, if there's a cause you believe in, a project you're working on, something like that, I like to give the floor over to the guests so that they can talk about and promote something. So if there's something you'd like to discuss, the floor is yours.
Well, I am on the writing and editing podcast. I'm a host, so if you're ever interested in listening, I urge you to do so, or even if you'd like to suggest yourself as a guest. But as for something that I'm extremely passionate about, it is animal welfare and the overcrowded pet shelters that we have. So even if you yourself are not ready to adopt an animal or available to adopt an animal, I still urge you to share some of their posts and hopefully somebody else will be able to find an animal to join their family. But you can also sponsor an adoption, which is something that I like to do for birthdays and that sort of thing. And that's usually a pretty minimal fee too. I think it's like $120, sometimes even less. So that way you're helping another animal find a family that might not have otherwise.
That is awesome. We've had several people talk about animals, and I love that because I grew up with dogs and rabbits and fish and all kinds of things. So
Yep, same.
I love animals, and it's a worthy cause. And then I'll also make sure I get whatever links from you for your podcast, and any other links, we'll get them in the show notes so people can find those if they're looking for them.
All right, great. Thank
All
you
right.
so much for having me.
Absolutely, Jenny. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for being part of Time We Discuss, and we found out what it was like to be a statistician and editor.
Thanks.
Thanks for popping in the studio. My name is Dan, and this is Time We Discuss. I really enjoyed speaking with Jenny today, and I hope you enjoyed the time too. Make sure you check the links in the description to learn more. If there's a professional you want me to cover, add a comment, and I'll find that person for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. That'll do it. See you next time on Time We Discuss.